Michael, we are here to figure out how to put something into my day, something that I need that 98% of people don't actively have as a habit during their day. And what is that?
Creativity. No?
Yes, you got the right answer.
Oh, goodness,
You are
because if it was
great.
something else, I might have not been the perfect person to talk about it, but creativity is good. Let's talk about that.
Let's talk about that. I don't ever go to a party and people are like, let's talk about creativity. Do you go to parties and say, hey, have you tried to increase your creativity? Do you know that, like, how do you start talking about that? It's not really like on the list of to do on people's resolutions.
You know, it should be. And I don't, necessarily go to parties that much anyway, but when I do talk to people, because it's what I do, right? I train companies in creativity. So I do talk about it a lot. And the other thing is that people have that weird thinking that creativity is just about art, right? And like it's about doing creative things. But it's actually really important. We talk about it all the time because everything we do all day is creative, right? If it's not, it's like brushing your teeth maybe isn't. But if you have to decide, what you want to do that afternoon, or you're making plans for the evening, those are all creative acts, right? If you're working someplace and your job is not completely boring and dull, then you're not just putting together parts of a car or something. You need to exercise creativity all the time. So yeah, it is something that I definitely talk to people about, and a lot of the time people don't think they're creative, right? In fact, they are. Everybody is born that way. It's how we learn as children. The problem is we don't practice it. So it's a perfect conversation to talk about habits, I think.
Because it's 2 weeks into New Year's resolutions, and 80% statistically of people have given up on their new resolutions. But if creativity, how hard is a creativity habit? Can you give me some examples that help you and your clients?
So one of the simplest creativity habits that people never do, right, is to actually schedule time to be creative. People think creativity is an accident, like something that accidentally happens, right? But one of the things that you can definitely do that will help you is to say, every Thursday at 10 a.m., you're going to take an hour or half an hour, and you're going to try to be creative about whatever it is you need to be creative about. So one of the great techniques for a company is to actually schedule that time into the schedule of the people working at the company. So, there are companies like Google that actually do that. I think it's Thursday afternoons. They have a time when you can work on some other project besides your job that, you then, of course, it's owned by Google, but it's you can come up with new ideas that way. And some of their new ideas have come from those sessions. So that's one habit, is just to actually schedule it, right? And, a part of that, Jessica, is that you don't necessarily have to get a result in that half hour or that hour. You just have to try to get a result and see what happens, right?
Okay, because I've come from the improv world, and I know you're in the acting, directing, that creativity world. For us, like when I think of creativity, I think like there's no objective. Like my goal is to finish the painting, but when I'm in the process, I'm not thinking about finishing the painting. I'm actually like in with the colors and the facial. So is creativity and achieving a goal not counterintuitive, or I don't know what word to use?
They are not. You're right that in many times in art, again, a lot of the time there's not a form to it necessarily. Although there's often a thought behind it, right? Like an intention. If someone wants to paint a picture of a bird, they kind of know what the bird looks like. If Picasso wanted to do cubism, he had a theory behind it, right? But when you're talking about creativity outside of art, it becomes usually much more rigorous in terms of a structure. Creative problem solving is a very common process, right? Design thinking is a very common process. These have very specific structures that you follow, right? In order to get what is a breakthrough result. To get a breakthrough, it often works best when you are using a rigid structure that you follow, right? Creative problem solving literally has steps that you go through, but the way you do those steps, for example, when get to the brainstorming step, is to generate lots of ideas and rules in that process, like no idea is a bad idea, generate lots of ideas, quality over quantity, but it is a process. It's not just woohoo thinking in the air. right? Because if you could come up with an idea already, you wouldn't need to be creative, right? If you already have a good idea, and the structure of it actually helps a lot.
So are there brain differences? Because if I think of my German uncles who are all engineers that have lived in their little box of everything is the way that their great grandma taught them. They don't watch this, so I can insult them. And then you tell me like, oh, they could be creative. And I'm like, that German engineer mind is like extremely precise. Whereas I find I don't know much about creativity. So can those guys learn how to be like 5% more, or are you suggesting even like 50% more creative?
Well, yeah, it's hard to measure how creative they are. There's tests for that, but this is actually another habit, right? Another habit is to try to do things that you don't normally do. So cross-disciplinary learning, for example, if you're an engineer, learn something very different from engineering. Read poetry.
Like emotion.
Sorry, I didn't hear you there. I think you froze. You said something.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll edit that.
Okay. So if you are doing one thing and you're saying there's certain people like engineers that aren't that creative compared to others, one of the things that's a habit that you can build is to actually intentionally learn things that are more creative or even outside of your normal thing you do, right? Even if it's not a quote unquote creative thing, looking at things from different perspectives can help you be more creative. So for example, an engineer could study, I don't know, English, read books that aren't necessarily creative books. They might be business books, but just to think differently. And once you start thinking differently, it becomes easier to connect to the creativity that's built into the people, because you are already very creative. You're an improv person, you're a speaker, you do stuff that's creative. But every single human being, as I said, is creative. It's just that they're not connecting to it. And that's why these kind of habits are good, because as you know, when you build a habit, it makes it easier to do the thing, right?
But do you believe that some people have a natural inclination towards creativity?
I think some people have a natural inclination to believe they're more creative. And when you believe you're more creative, you are more creative, right? But as I said, it's pretty much it's been surveyed and tested that children, when they're 4, 5, 6 years old, are all creative. Right? There's no person that is not creative when they're a child. It's just that as we grow up, we start to decide, how we are, the way we are, how we think about certain things, and the world really demands of us that we specialize, right? And the more we specialize, the less creative we become, for the reason I just outlined, that the more multidisciplinary you are, the more creative it's easy to be. So the number one thing, that it's another habit, I guess, if you get up in the morning and look in the mirror and tell yourself you're creative, you will be more creative that day.
I never thought, I don't read about these studies, but that we learn things through creativity and openness, and then like the 5-year-olds start to become more, what does the engineer mind and the Burning Man artist is a very different development, let's say. But studies suggest that at age 3, they had the same level of creativity?
Yeah, the studies are really targeted more at 4, 5, 6, but yes, they are universally creative geniuses. It is easy, and we're talking about ideation, right? We're talking about coming up with ideas. Small children come up with ideas freely. They don't limit their thinking, right? So since we're talking habits, another habit you can engage in is to actually practice letting yourself have ideas that are bad, right? One of the great techniques we use in training or in ideation processes is to get people to think of bad ideas, because that's really easy, right? It's easy to think of bad ideas. When you try to think of good ideas, your mind kind of seizes up because you're scared that it's not a good idea. You're scared people will judge you, or even yourself will judge you, right? So experimenting with like stupid ideas, things that won't work, a lot of that kind of stuff also helps a lot.
Do you know the improv game, World's Worst Advice?
World's Worst?
Advice.
I don't, but it sounds very similar.
We can play it for a sec if you're open
Okay.
to it.
Let's play.
I ask you, usually play with more than two people, but that's all we got. So I think of a problem that needs to be solved, and
Okay.
you give me, well, it's called good advice, bad advice, worst advice. So you give me good advice. So I need to cut my hair. So your good advice would be?
Go to a hair salon.
Perfect. Now I do bad advice. And then after I finish that, you finish off the third one with the worst advice possible for this problem.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so go to hair salon, rub your hair on broken glass.
Okay, I'm going to say go to a sawmill with a big chainsaw and strap yourself to the thing that they push across the chainsaw and have them cut your hair with that.
That is the worst advice. Yeah. Yeah. And so then if you do that enough times about that problem that you have at work, now you don't feel so stupid when you actually say your real ideas. That might be actually a little bit stupid.
Well, that's part of it. The other part, Jessica, that's amazing is, and I don't know how to really apply it in the case of the buzzsaw, but when you get bad ideas, they often turn into good ideas by flipping them around. So do you want me to give you an example of a real life? There was a company called Woolmark. They had to come up with a campaign for New York Fashion Week. And they did this exercise of the worst ideas. So the worst idea they came up with was to have a flock of sheep run through the middle of Times Square through the opening ceremony of the New York Fashion Week, right? Mm-hmm. It's an exceptionally bad idea. It would look terrible. People would get freaked out. Somebody would probably get hurt. They'd get sued. You know, it's a whole thing, right? But because of that bad idea, they ended up coming up with a version of that idea, which was to have an elite fashion model walking a sheep down Madison Avenue on a leash. And that became a very iconic poster for their company. So that's kind of how that works.
Wow. Gotcha. Mm-hmm. And so because improv teaches psychological safety, because equal speaking time, make your partner look good. That's what they find out. That is when people feel safe. So if you are in an environment like a company that allows you to look like an idiot and say wrong things, what is the connection between like the hiring process? Do they hire creative people because they know they have to innovate? And well, these are like two kind of questions. Like, does Google at the interview thing measure people's creativity because they know they have to be leading edge? And can other companies do that? Or how do they get a feel and build that?
Look, I don't know the hiring processes of specific companies, but what I do know is that most companies they're not thinking about how creative people are when they're hiring them, actually. No? That's not, I don't think that's their top concern in most companies, unless it's specifically a creative job, right? But for normal, every job that's not considered a creative job, you still need large amounts of creativity to succeed, especially as we go forward more and more into the fourth and fifth industrial revolutions, right? You need creativity because, you know, ChatGPT can write your report. You don't need to be good at writing reports. But in order to have new ideas, ChatGPT cannot do that because it's, you know, using data that exists and it can't come up with new ideas. So creativity is important. And I don't think most companies select for that. I had another thought I wanted to share. What was it? Oh, right. You said that, you know, making mistakes or getting the wrong thing, it's a very good policy. It's a very good thing to institute in a company is to make sure that there's psychological safety to make mistakes and fail, right? 95% of product innovations fail. So if you're stuck on the idea that it has to succeed, you're not going to have a very good innovation program, right? Because you have to have failures before you get a success. And I mean, there's very few things that succeed the first time, right? Wow. So, and the third thing I thought of as you were saying that is that, you know, companies want to, you said psychological safety, and they don't necessarily think about that, right? What's very important is that, in fact, there was a study done by MIT that showed that the most creative teams were the ones that had the most equal level of communication. So it wasn't about one person was highly creative and talked a lot and the others didn't. You know, it was the number one selector for what the best ideas were was how much psychological safety was there to be equal in sharing your ideas. So
beautiful. Since you and I are both certified in adaptability quotient with AQAI, do you think that companies are more likely to ask how adaptable you are, or more how creative you are in this, in this era?
I think it depends. Like here in South Africa, where I'm sitting, I think adaptability is still a mystery to most companies. I think in Spain, where you're sitting, it's probably a bit more in vogue. I'm not sure.
No.
Is it?
No.
No?
We still think NLP is like the hottest new thing off the printing press.
So I would say that in South Africa, creativity just makes more sense to people.
Okay.
It's something that people understand. Adaptability, some people would say, okay, for example, with something like burnout or mental health, they understand, I think, that adaptability would help them with that. They understand, I think, that adaptability would help with the rapidly changing pace of knowledge and information. But for me, and this is like for me specifically in what I do, I don't see them as very different things. Adaptability for me is like a step that precedes creativity in the sense that you have to adapt first in how you see things, how you are being about those things, and so on, in order to be creative, in the sense that creativity is thinking differently from yourself. Because if you're thinking the same way all the time, you might solve a problem in a better way than another person, but you won't necessarily solve the problem you need to solve, because it's something that you don't need creativity to solve something if you're already good at solving that thing, right? But if it's something that's a challenge, something that you're struggling to solve, then you need to be creative, and that starts by adapting the way you're approaching the problem. So for me, it's a 3-step process: adapt, create, innovate, and they're all kind of the same thing in a way.
Okay. Adapt, create, innovate. ACI doesn't say anything. Huh?
ACI, that's what it is. ACI. Yep.
Aki, depends how you pronounce the C. Asi. Acai. Okay. Okay, Mr. Creativity. You came from the world of creativity. When I saw you in Bali, I didn't know I didn't really know about your acting, recording, directing. Tell me a little bit about that part of you.
Okay, I'm a speaker. I'm not an actor at all, right? I've acted in a couple of really low-class movies like many years ago, but I spent 20 years in the film industry as a producer and director. Okay. Focusing more now on training creativity and speaking about it. Only working on a couple of projects in the film industry. I'm also teaching creativity and innovation in a film school, but I spent like a good 20 plus years working in the film industry as a primarily reality TV and documentaries,
cool.
real life stuff.
Yeah. Real life stuff. I saw this publicity for South Africa with the funny comedian from down by you guys. No, it's like a stunning South Africa publicity.
Trevor Noah?
Yeah. Have you seen that ad?
I have, actually. It's a really good ad, yeah.
Very funny. Very funny. And very few ads go for funny, because there's like so many cultural differences with funny. There's so much you can offend, right? But I guess if you hire a comedian, he has permission to offend some people.
I think Trevor Noah is probably one of the best, if not the best, in South Africa, at least, in translating humor across. Because, he was doing The Daily Show for 5 years or whatever. He's spent a lot of time in the States by this point. He lives there now. And so I think he's good at translating South African humor into an American context. So I think he'd be one of the few people that could do that.
Nailed it. Oh, well, Mr. Michael Brian Lee, you live in New York and you live in South Africa. Is there a direct flight?
Yeah, there is. It's rare. There's only one that I know of, but there is.
Like hours? What is it?
Let's see. Last time I went, I believe it was 14. Yeah. I think it was 14. It might be 16.
And you sound like me, but I guess you were not raised in South Africa. You were raised in the USA.
Yeah, I'm a South African by naturalization, which is a hard word to say. Naturalization.
What does that mean?
I'm not a South African by birth at all. I've only been here for 24 years. Yeah,
Okay. And naturalization means you applied for the passport and you got it?
I did. Took me
Oh,
3 years. I got it. Yep. I would have brought it with me if you told me ahead of time, but it took me a couple minutes to get it. So just
That's
trust
very
me.
short. Okay, okay. New Yorker in South Africa. As a little boy, well, it depends. If your grandfather was from South Africa, maybe you imagined yourself one day living in South Africa, but that's a pretty far jump for most North Americans. We never visualize living in South Africa, I think.
No. You know, when all the stuff was happening here in '94, and like Mandela was coming out of prison and getting elected president, and the whole transition into a non-apartheid government and all of that, I remember before that when I was in university, which reveals my age a little bit more than I'd probably like to. You know, there were those shanty towns on college campuses where they were protesting against apartheid, like in the late '80s. And, you know, I was exposed to that, but it really did not interest me. I would have never thought that I was going to end up here.
Mm, mm.
In '94, when all that was happening, I was in Prague and I thought I'd be there forever. So you got to just, you know, creativity, adaptability, you got to just go with the flow sometimes, I guess. The world takes you where it wants to take you, you know?
Well, when you say yes and to opportunities, you might end up in Prague in South Africa and Bali in October and in 2 years in Australia for our next Global Speaker Summit, right?
Are you going?
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Me
Ticket.
too.
Yeah. Can't buy flights until like a year before though. So I was like, maybe I can buy them really cheap 2 years in advance, but they don't know if there's going to be flights in 2 years. So.
Why is that? Why do they do that? Why do they limit that? Why? It's a limitation. Now, one more thing. I think we're almost out of time, but one more thing, another habit is to actually embrace boundaries and limitations. Right? That might sound, like you said, a couple other things, anti-logical. But when you are trying to be creative, boundaries are some of the best things you can encounter, because when you're solving a problem, part of the solution to the problem comes from the fact that you cannot change certain elements of the problem. Right? If you could change those things, then it wouldn't be a problem. You know, if you have a budget for this podcast, that's your budget, you know, and it's probably not a lot, right? So you have that budget and you have to find ways to make it happen inside of that budget. Those restrictions force you to be creative and come up with new ways of doing something that you wouldn't have to do if you had a budget of $100,000 to do the podcast, right? So another habit is to embrace those.
You are the perfect person to ask. I've been waiting to ask this question to someone who knows the answer. I hope you know the answer. I've been thinking with my friends for years now that, well, who innovates, right? And is it, maybe there's studies on this, so please help me out. Is it the wealthy people who have access to all the research and the funding, but they really don't have a need to innovate because everything they can just buy, it's quite easy? Or is it the poor, but they don't have the time to develop those things, but they really need it and have actually need to find solutions to do things faster with less resources? Or is it the middle ground who have a little bit of both that create most things?
It's all of them, Jess.
Really?
It's all of them. I mean, Elon Musk has a lot of money. He's very innovative, right? There are a lot of people working for Elon Musk who are very innovative, and they're, I guess, in the middle. And there are certainly, if you're really poor, you got to innovate a lot of the time just to survive.
Yeah.
Right? If you're looking at the Maslow hierarchy, they put creativity on the top. Right?
Oh, yeah?
Maslow himself didn't do that. His disciples did that. And, you know, because self-actualization's at the top.
Yeah.
And at the bottom is survival, right? Just having food and a place to sleep. But for a lot of people, getting food and a place to sleep is a highly creative act, because if they don't know where they're going to get their next meal, they have to figure it out, right? That's innovative. That is creative. So I would say I mean, first of all, I love being told I'm the perfect person for something, because that's very rare. But I would say all of them. And, you know, here's another example. Henry Ford started out as an employee of Thomas Edison, right? Edison started out as a relatively not very wealthy person, but
Mm.
he created so many different inventions and so many patents that he became extremely wealthy, right? So wealthy that he had an entire company of people doing his work for him by the end. One
Oh,
of those
yeah.
people was Henry Ford, who was also not wealthy when he started working for Edison, but he ended up learning from that and became Henry Ford, who didn't invent a car. Actually, he invented the assembly line, and came up with a lot of techniques to improve the speed and the cost of creating the cars. Right, so his innovation was not the car itself; it was the way of producing the car to make it mass marketable.
It's
But
true.
he got his stuff from working for Edison. So
You got the habits.
hey,
If you're a person of low recursos, as we say in Spanish, low resources, if you learn from those who know what they're doing, so like hip hip hooray for mentorship, and from learning from those wiser, more, whatever the word is than you, you get a fair like foot into the race, no?
yeah, for sure. I mean, the advice I would give somebody if I wanted to give advice, which I seldom do, is that if they are not empowered with resources, it definitely helps to do one of two things: starve until you succeed, which is how a lot of entrepreneurs do things, or get a job with someone who's very innovative and will give you the space to do that. That's where you can work for a Google or an Apple or whatever, who might give you the space to do that. But far be it for me to tell people whether they want to be an employee or an entrepreneur, right? We unfortunately have fallen into the terrible, terrible fate of entrepreneurship, where we're the product, which is that's the worst thing we could have done, Jess.
Is it? That's how I feel in January, being the product. I don't want to sell the product, but I am the product. And that's what's selling me. So
here we are.
I've never been an employee though, so I don't think I can do it. I'm not much of a listener to authority, but
you and I do have something in common there. I've never had a job either.
No, really.
Never. I've had contract work. I've done some work for people, but never an actual job like where you get like medical cover and a contract.
What's a medical plan, right? What's a Christmas party? I've always wanted to go to a Christmas party and drink. I don't even drink, but drink and make out with like the guy I've had a crush on in that floor for 3 years, and then giggle with my friends about it, and then talk about it at the water cooler the next week. I've never been to a Christmas party.
Or a CV that actually has companies on
it. Not the ones we just made up that didn't work. Right. The new on top of it,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Oh, exactly. The entrepreneurs. Well, we are creative. Well, at least we're creative. At least we have lots of great values, I'm sure. Mercedes in my driveway, I don't have yet, but I have an abundance of creativity. So that's a blessing, I suppose. And I've worked hard, I suppose, to get that based on your theory. I didn't lose it as a child, which makes me feel proud of myself that I didn't let society take it away from me. Take that, society.
Take that. About 1 in every 50 people are still as creative as they were when they were a child. So
50?
Well done. 1 in about every 50 people. Yeah.
I actually might be. I'm like, I didn't realize that was so special. I just thought, oh, I'm creative and everybody else is creative. But what you're saying is everyone was creative, but they lost it, and I kept it. Yeah. Thank you. You've, without planning to, have made me feel kind of proud of myself. I'm glad
I've done something useful. I guess I'm the perfect person for that too.
You are the perfect person for my day today. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Michael from South Africa, New York. Thank you for the time.
Cool. Can I give you one more last thing to take with you?
Yes.
Another habit you can adopt is kind of similar to scheduling time, but it's slightly different. Come up with a ritual, right, that you can do every time you want to be creative, like listening to a certain piece of music or doing a certain breathing exercise, something that's the same every time. because your subconscious, and this is a whole nother interview, but your subconscious is the source of ideas. You know how we have that idea of the aha moment, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's because it's a surprise when you get a good idea, because it comes from your subconscious. It's not something you can think of intentionally. So when you have that idea, it's best to trigger that idea by getting in touch with your subconscious. And if you repeatedly build the habit of constantly always doing the same thing, you will actually trigger your subconscious to be active.
Is that like NLP, what's that called? When you anchor something? Do you think the music is an anchor to creativity?
It is a bit of an NLP anchor. I didn't think of it that way, but yeah, I'd say that it is anchoring your creativity. Thank you.
I have an anchor for eating donuts. When I walk by and smell it, I get reminded of joy and happiness, and I must eat one. That's that's one of those anchors, right? When something reminds you of what it used to be like, and then it just sucks you in to the donut hole, and then you're there for a couple dozen.
Sounds like a backwards anchor, though. Like, it seems like you need an anchor to stop you from eating donuts. I think
I would have had to make the anchor to stop eating donuts, but I've never done that. So I still have the anchor of like joy, joy in the donut.
Joy, another good thing for creativity, Jess. So
joy.
Yep.
It's nice to be creative. I feel blessed. Thank you. This was really valuable to me. To the rest of you watching. Hopefully to you too, but I am happy. Cool.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
I might be in South Africa in May for the Toastmasters conference. So maybe I'll see you. Are you Johannesburg?
I'm in Johannesburg, and if you don't tell me and don't spend a couple hours with me, I will be very upset.
Okay, well then it's a deal. Thank you, Michael. Ciao.
I'm shaking your hand.
Okay. What, Michael?